Okay. Welcome to EPG Pathshala. We are dealing with the paper English Literature 1590 to 1798, and we are going to be looking at the background to the rise of the novel in the 18th century. I am Anna Kurian and I teach at the University of Hyderabad in the Department of English. We all know that the novel becomes a prominent form in English literature in the 18th century, but that of course does not mean that the novel just burst into the limelight in the 18th century out of nothing. There were several factors that contributed to the rise of the novel in this era, and today we shall be looking at some of them. We shall look at how storytelling began. We begin at that point, and from there we shall bring it through the centuries till the 18th century, when we have the first novels being written in English in England itself. Now, storytelling is something that is primary and primordial to all mankind. Everyone loves stories. And the first stories were told by wandering storytellers or minstrels or bards or singers as they traveled from village to village, taking the same stories to different parts of the world. Now, this was the model that was carried on through the Dark Ages, the Middle Ages, up to actually in several societies even till today. This storytelling tradition continues. But the storyteller, as he wandered through various villages and regions, sometimes changed his background and his location in keeping with the location where he was. So the story would remain the same, but the details would be things that he would include from the culture, the society, the village which he was telling the story in at that particular point. Now this is important because it contributes one element to the novel, that novels have local interest. They tell you stories which are rooted in a specific place and which are then identifiable because of the place that they are coming from. Now, the wandering singers, the minstrels, the storytellers who carried these tales to all parts of the world during that period told the same stories more or less over and over again. Stories first began to be written down in the late Middle Ages and the early modern. So you have people who began to write stories as fiction, whether in poetry or in prose. In some parts of the world, they began as early, of course, as classical antiquity. So you have stories from classical Greek and Latin as well. And you have plays which also told stories. Now, drama is, of course, very distinct from the novel, but the fact of the story remains central to both drama as well as the novel. In medieval times, there were also romances and allegories become important also because they are connected in one way to the church as well. If storytellers, bards, singers were the first storytellers, then another set of storytellers is that associated with the church. The church and religion, the Bible specifically for England, had a bunch of stories which were circulated because it was held that stories help make it easier for the common man who is illiterate to understand the truths which are contained in the Bible or any other religious book. In addition to these, there were other kinds of stories that circulated as well. In England, the primary story was a story regarding King Arthur and his many knights of the Round Table. Now, these were stories which were part of local culture. Local English culture, that there was a king such as Arthur and he had several knights, and there are stories associated with each of the knights. Now those stories then also circulated during this period. In addition to that, there were other stories. There was, of course, the story of Troy. And the legend of Troy is something which we are familiar with today, initially from the Iliad, from Homer in classical Greek times, but it's also given to us in various versions through time. So what we have then is a lineage for the novel which begins as early as classical Greece and later on Rome, where they tell stories about their own heroic figures. So the Iliad, of course, gives us many heroic figures, whether you'll think of Achilles or you think of Hector or you think of Ulysses or Agamemnon. So it gives us a bunch of stories connected with these people. In England, you had the story of King Arthur. In France, you had somebody called Charlemagne. So all of them provided stories which were common across European cultures, and these stories then moved from culture to culture or country to country. Now, one of the big steps which makes stories and the circulation of stories more easy is the coming of the printing press. When Caxton invents the printing press, storytelling became, in one way, easier. It became easier to circulate stories because people could then get stories as they were printed and read them. This, of course, also then says that we should have a literate public. The increase in the rate of literacy becomes crucial. But there are other factors as well. There was the fact that people were more interested in trade, and the mercantile life was replacing slowly the life of knights, chivalry, and medieval romance, which till then had been central. So when these people who were merchant classes, people who were tradesmen, when they traveled from place to place, they also then brought other kinds of stories with them. It was not just a story from their own village or town, but during their travels, they picked up other stories which then they circulated. In England, one of the earliest collection of stories that we are familiar with as students of literature is, of course, Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, where you have a group of pilgrims who are going to Canterbury, where each of them tells a tale. Now, the structure of the text itself is such that they were supposed to tell two tales, going and coming. But what we have now is only a tale per person, a story per person. But if you think about it, that forms one of the earliest ancestors of the novel in English, Chaucer's stories in the Canterbury Tales. And an example would be The Wife of Bath's Tale. In addition to that, you also have something like Malory's Le Morte d'Arthur, which is once again the story of King Arthur. And Le Morte d'Arthur, which is a collection of Arthurian legends, circulated stories which are to do with chivalry, knighthood, and honor, and of course knights rescuing ladies, and so on and so forth. The last one which we have to think about in this context is Don Quixote. Now, Don Quixote comes to us not from English, but from Spanish. And Cervantes' novel, Don Quixote, is seen as central to the rise of the novel in England, because it came to England in translation, and it comes around the same time as Shakespeare. I mean, Cervantes and Shakespeare are in one sense living approximately at the same time. So it comes to us soon after, and therefore contributes also to the rise of the novel in English. And then finally there is John Bunyan. John Bunyan and his Pilgrim's Progress is crucial to an understanding of the novel, because Bunyan wrote an allegory about a pilgrim who is making his way to the city of God, and the trials and the tribulations and the troubles that he encounters as he goes to God, as he goes to heaven. Now, that story, even though it is an allegory, even though it is rooted in the Bible and so on and so forth, also told a very real story, because the people that he met, they had realistic elements. The conversations that he had again, it was like the ordinary conversation of human beings. So these then are some of the texts that contribute to the rise of the novel in English. In addition to that, we also have several others, especially during Elizabethan England. Three names which are significant include John Lyly and Thomas Delany and Thomas Dekker. In addition to that, you have Thomas Nash, who wrote The Unfortunate Traveller, and of course you have other writers who wrote something called character. Now, when we go back and we go through this inventory, what we see is that Thomas Delany and Thomas Dekker gave us realistic kind of fiction. They told us about the real life of traders, guildsmen, artisans, people who worked with their hands in the villages and in the towns creating things. So it's a kind of middle class and lower middle class fiction, which the stories that they were telling. Thomas Nash's Unfortunate Traveller, which is one of the most popular texts of the period, is this really racy account of a guy who goes traveling on the continent and all the adventures that he encounters over there. John Lyly, of course, is more responsible for style than for the content, because we don't really think of him in terms of what he wrote in Euphues. Rather, we think of the Euphuistic style, which means that he did not state anything directly, rather it was done in an indirect fashion. And Sidney, writing Arcadia, gave us the formal order of verse in prose. So all of them contributed, and this, therefore, we are looking at the Elizabethan period, and we're looking at what the Elizabethans and the Jacobeans contributed to the writing and the development of the novel in English. Later on, you have a couple of very significant developments. One is the founding of the Royal Society. The second is the authorized version of the Bible. Now, the authorized version of the Bible, which was authorized by King James I and which comes out in 1611, gave us a prose style which is particular to English, and that prose rhythm shapes the prose rhythm of English prose for many centuries to come. Even today, to the English in the authorized version of the Bible, or the King James version of the Bible, is seen as a benchmark to which people aspire, because it's seen as being beautiful, measured prose, and yet having the musicality of verse. The formation of the Royal Society also gave us another thing. There they showed us how science worked. And because their deliberations and their accounts were all in prose, they helped us to demonstrate how prose should be written to show accurately realistic elements and realistic things. Then, of course, you have the fact that each age has a spirit of the age, if you will, which makes certain forms particular to that age rise up and dominate the age. Now, during Elizabethan times or Renaissance England, drama dominated. Drama dominated because people didn't have that much literacy, and so they could not read that much. Books were not so easily available, and therefore then an oral culture which could be listened to was far more common and far more popular. So drama dominates, and because of the dominance of drama during that period, people developed certain ideas which later on became crucial to an understanding of the novel. One was the presentation of character. When we think of the depth of the character portrayals of plays, whether it is Faustus or whether it is any of Shakespeare's plays, or whether later on John Webster's Duchess of Malfi, what we see is that character was shown to be not this kind of monolithic, flat character who never grows, but somebody who develops, who grows, and who changes in the course of the play. And this the novel adapted from earlier drama of the late 16th, early 17th centuries. Similarly, the presentation of dialogue in a novel was said to be influenced by the dramatic speeches and the conversation of the dramas of the Renaissance era. And of course, the fact that during the Renaissance era, there was a mixing of lots of genres, so tragedy and comedy, but also other genres, everything was muddled up. That gave the novel also the possibility of mixing and matching various genres, so that it did not necessarily have to be one gloomy story from beginning to end, but could be something which was more mixed up and therefore more entertaining for the masses. Later on, in the latter half of the 17th century and the beginnings of the 18th century, you have periodicals and the writing of people such as Addison and Steele in the periodicals. When they introduced characters like Sir Roger de Coverley, what we see is that this again forms one more of those forerunners of the character sketch in a novel, that novels had to have well-developed characters. If you think about any of the novels that you've read, a character who remains the same from beginning to end makes for a very boring novel. If you want to be interested, they should have some development, some changes should come. They should learn from what happens to them. And so when you saw characters being developed either on stage or in essays such as the Coverley Papers by Addison and Steele, then you would then realize that these people also contributed to the making of the novel and the didactic purpose. Now, didacticism or moral reform is something which today in the 21st century we sneer at. But in the 18th and the 19th centuries, didacticism or reformative agendas were something that was central to a lot of writers. And the periodical essayists were interested in reform, and also then the early novelists were also interested in reforming the society that they saw around them. So that is also a trait then that comes to us from the periodical essays of the time. Today we think of Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe and Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels as two of the earliest novels, and there is no dispute about the fact that these are novels. But we should also remember that these are the earliest versions of the novel as we know it today. Now, Robinson Crusoe is crucial because it tells us a story in prose about one man who goes traveling, gets stranded upon an island, his life on that island, and how eventually he is rescued and he comes back. Robinson Crusoe has, of course, as we all know, also become a cult text for post-colonial critics and post-colonial writers, because Robinson Crusoe goes to what he thinks is an uninhabited island. There he meets with natives, he dominates those natives, he makes the island his, he names the native that he finds, so he gets a native servant and he calls him Friday, and so on and so forth. What we see then when he writes Robinson Crusoe, the earliest novel, if you will, is a form as well as content that then changed the way that the novel itself was perceived during this time. It's also important to think of Robinson Crusoe as special because Robinson Crusoe then gave birth to a whole bunch of novels written more or less in the same fashion. And it was not only in England that this happened, but also in other cultures. So you have the Swiss Family Robinson, which comes to us from Johann Wyss, and similar books which were written across other countries as well, where people went traveling, got shipwrecked, stayed on an island, then did whatever they did, and eventually joined civilization again. Now, these writings, this as well as Gulliver's Travels, which we'll talk about in 2 minutes, this and Gulliver's Travels are emblematic also of the time. So a novel is also rooted in its time when we think about it. The 18th century is when travelers are going out all over the world, and not just explorers and discoverers, but ordinary men and women. They are going traveling on ships across the world, and as they travel, they see new cultures, and as they travel, there is also, of course, the beginnings of empire. And when we look at a text like, say, Gulliver's Travels or Defoe's Robinson Crusoe, we are talking in terms of a text that then reflects and endorses a mission that is civilizational and that is also, of course, connected to empire building. Now, Gulliver's Travels again tells the story of one man, Lemuel Gulliver, who goes traveling, and he goes to 4 places. So each of those 4 places, he tells us exactly what the society is like and how it is different and so on and so forth. It was, of course, strongly satirical via different societies, different cultures. Jonathan Swift was satirizing all that he saw as troublesome, difficult, and disgusting in England. But it is also something, if you think about it, Gulliver's Travels are also recommended as children's books. So when we think about a book that was originally meant to be satirical of English society being recommended as a children's book, we think also then of the ways in which the novel can be adapted. Books that are meant for one audience need not necessarily always be read by that audience. It can be read by others as well. An example would be to think in terms of something like Harry Potter, which was initially meant for children. And later on, of course, the whole world is reading Harry Potter, from 70-year-olds to 10-year-olds. So Gulliver's Travels similarly was not meant for small children to be read at all, because it was so savagely satirical of the human, the English human being. And instead now it is read across countries in India as well as abroad by children when they are small, and they see it as an amusing book for children because he encounters giants, he encounters tiny little pygmy people, he encounters, of course, a race of horses who are far more intelligent and far more compassionate and special and human than humans actually are. And humans in Gulliver's Travels are called yahoos. So we are then being shown the scope of the novel. Even though the novel at this point is still in its infancy, we are being shown exactly how much can be done in a novel by both Defoe as well as by Swift. And they perfect English prose. So they showed us how to use English prose as a vehicle for, of course, storytelling, but also for a text in which the character develops, the character grows. And this is particularly so of Robinson Crusoe. Robinson Crusoe, from the time that he lands on the island till the time that finally he leaves, and all his interactions on the island, with the island itself and later on with Friday and with other natives, initially, of course, completely alone. It shows us, therefore, then how to use prose as a vehicle to convey truths in the novel. Now we move on to a discussion of the four major writers of the novel in the 18th century. That's Samuel Richardson, then Fielding and Smollett and Laurence Sterne. We begin, of course, with Samuel Richardson. Samuel Richardson is revered or vilified, call it which you will, for his two major novels, Pamela and Clarissa. Now, Pamela, which is usually said to be the first novel in English, though of course this is kind of disputable because you can have so many others contending for this position, from Thomas Delany's works in Jack of Newbury and so on and so forth in Elizabeth in England, via Thomas Nash's An Unfortunate Traveller, through till here, right? But it's usually claimed to be the first novel in English, and it was published in 1740. Now, a couple of things that make Pamela stand out is one, of course, the epistolary mode. So it also then introduces us to the fact that a novel does not only always have to be told in third-person narrative, and it does not have to begin and end with the story being told. Instead, it can also be written as letters. So Pamela is a series of letters which is being written by the eponymous heroine Pamela to her parents as she works in the house of a young knight. Now, it was also interesting because what Pamela does through 7 volumes of letters written to her parents is defend her beauty against her master, who is determined to get her into bed. Now, when you think about it, there isn't really very much to be said about it. But she manages to convey through 7 letters her mental state of helplessness, her anger and her anguish at being treated in this way, her powerlessness in the face of his superior power, and yet she manages to defend herself and her beauty successfully through 7 volumes, till the point at which the master, overcome by lust or longing or love, whatever it is, finally offers her marriage, and Pamela, the novel, ends happily with Pamela getting married to the man. Now, in the 21st century, this sounds like a really boring text. I mean, it's, for one, it is extremely large, and two, the story of somebody who goes on saying no to a man and then eventually, of course, marries the man, and this is her route to getting married to the man and improving her position in life. Now, if you think about it in this way, then it is, of course, boring. But what is important about Pamela and its tragic counterpart Clarissa, where she also adopts the same strategy, except that Clarissa is eventually raped and dies an unhappy person. So what is important about both these texts is that they explore the mental state of the heroine rather than just talk about what is happening out there. So it is not events so much as the exploration of the mental condition and the feelings and the emotions of the heroine that is crucial in these texts. If you think about it, then these texts become precursors to something like, say, Tess of the D'Urbervilles, which is the quintessential novel where the heroine's mental status is given to us over and over again by Thomas Hardy. So this then gives us a novel of sensibility where we analyze, we ponder over, we spend a lot of time exploring the mental state of Pamela and later on, of course, Clarissa. Now, when we think about Samuel Richardson, we are also thinking about somebody who was solidly middle class. He was not from the upper classes, he was middle class in his birth. He served as an apprentice to a printer, and then of course he gets married, and later on he combines a literary career with a preoccupation with several worldly affairs. But one thing that was significant about him was also that he was interested in reforming society. He did not like the powerlessness that he saw in the society around him. And his texts show us how he saw that powerlessness as leading to certain social evils. So when we look at Pamela and Clarissa, we are then talking about a world which he sees as problematic and how he thinks those problems can be resolved. So he had this didactic purpose in writing his novels, and two, he improved the position of women via his novel writing, because the central characters in 2 of the earliest English novels are women, and they are women who, one of them of course makes her way in life, and she's a strong woman character. So what we see is then 2 of the trajectories of the novel in English are given to us by Samuel Richardson right in the beginning. Then of course we come to Henry Fielding. Now Henry Fielding is known best for 2 novels, Joseph Andrews and Tom Jones. Now both of these novels have certain elements which are common. One is that they can be called a Bildungsroman, and the other one is, of course, that they can be called a picaresque novel. A picaresque novel follows the character of a picaro or a rogue as he goes through various adventures, so it's kind of episodic as well. And eventually, he comes to a happy ending where he succeeds or he is able to achieve some measure of happiness in life. The Bildungsroman, of course, shows us a child or a young person growing up into adulthood and growing up into a society. If initially he is at war with that society or the society is seen to be against him, eventually he is integrated into that society, he or she. So both of Fielding's novels, Joseph Andrews as well as Tom Jones, features this young kind of hero who then follows this trajectory, eventually, of course, becoming respectable members of society. Fielding, unlike Samuel Richardson, came from a different background. He was schooled at Eton, so we immediately know the class differentials. He comes from a higher class than Samuel Richardson did, and he studied law. He also had a far more light-hearted view of life than Richardson did. So you have Fielding's Joseph Andrews, which is a much more genial, much more fun read than Richardson's Pamela could ever be. Richardson's Pamela can bore the socks off you, but Fielding's Joseph Andrews is something which can be read and enjoyed even today. Interesting also is, of course, the fact that Fielding was a chronicler of the social state of London, England, more specifically England, not London, during this period. And though he was both a moralist and a satirist, his satire was not as savage and biting as, say, the satire of Jonathan Swift. So he is far more gentle in his satire, and when he does show us nasty things happening in the world around, he shows it to us with a more humorous style than, say, the angry, incisive and destructive satire that Jonathan Swift employed. The other two novelists of the four great novelists that we are looking at, Tobias Smollett and Laurence Sterne, are not really as studied as the other two. So Samuel Richardson and Fielding are far more studied than Tobias Smollett and Laurence Sterne. And yet Smollett's works as well as Sterne's works give us a lot of trajectories which later on the novel adapts. One, of course, is the fact that Smollett wrote about life at sea, but far more important than that is that he started the style of caricature in the novel, a style that becomes predominant in the work of Charles Dickens. And Laurence Sterne is important because he was experimenting with the idea of the novel. Now, when you think about the fact that the novel just came to life, somebody who's already experimenting with it, it's like saying that you are experimenting on a baby. But Laurence Sterne experimented on Tristram Shandy. He destroyed the idea of chronological sequencing, so it did not proceed normally from one event to the next in time and space. Instead, it was completely random. And he is supposed to have done something which is really startling, and that is that he inspires, or he might have been seen to be, the influence which James Joyce uses in Ulysses. So what we have is somebody like Laurence Sterne and Tobias Smollett influencing two of the greatest novelists of all time, Charles Dickens and James Joyce. And that discarding of chronological sequence as well as several other innovations. Laurence Sterne's work is full of innovations, and those innovations are interesting. So even though we may not enjoy reading it, it is still worthwhile reading a text like Tristram Shandy. There are, of course, several other novelists in the 18th century, and several of them also whom we should be looking at. So when you begin with somebody like, say, Oliver Goldsmith. Now, Oliver Goldsmith we know also as the author of the play She Stoops to Conquer, but he also wrote The Vicar of Wakefield, which is seen as being something like a novel. The Vicar of Wakefield was a domestic novel, if you will. Then, of course, you have Dr. Johnson, who tried his hand at practically every form, every genre. He wrote an Oriental novel. Horace Walpole wrote a Gothic novel, The Castle of Otranto. And Caleb Williams was a sociological novel which analyzed social and economic ills by William Godwin. What we are attempting to do by showing you these examples is also to show you that the novel as it comes to life in the 18th century and as it becomes a dominant form in the 18th century also becomes several other things. It just does not remain the novel. Instead, it becomes the sociological novel, the Gothic novel, the Oriental novel, and so on and so forth. So you have various forms within the novel also. We also have something else that happens during this period. Now, if you think about Renaissance drama, there are not any Renaissance dramatists who are women. But the 18th century novel begins with, of course, the men. But soon after, you have lots of women who start writing novels. Primary among them are the following, including amongst themselves: Anne Radcliffe, who writes a Gothic novel; Fanny Burney, who chronicles middle and upper class life; Charlotte Smith, who writes again a Gothic novel; and Maria Edgeworth. Now, if we thought that all these novels were being written for adult audiences, then Maria Edgeworth becomes the exception to the rule because she writes for both children as well as for adults. And Castle Rackrent is a regional novel as well. So now if you look at it, we have a range of novels which have been written during this period. Finally, of course, the range is given to us over here. You have the Oriental tale, which would be an example of that would be Johnson's Rasselas. You have the Gothic novel, which would be, say, Anne Radcliffe's Mysteries of Udolpho, or you could have the Castle of Otranto also. Then you have the domestic comedy, and that would be The Vicar of Wakefield. You have the sociological novel, which would be Caleb Williams. And so we see that 18th century gives us the novel not as one form, but as a multitude of forms. The important features of the 18th century novel, just to recap, it gives us realism, it gives us the episodic structure, but it also gives us the epistolary structure. And it helps us to realize that early novelists were interested in reformation of society via the novel. There was a strong focus on the middle class and an emphasis on characterization during this period. Thus, we have now come to the end of our discussion of the rise of the novel, and we have been looking at several features as to how the novel came about, from the beginning of storytellers who told stories as an oral form, through written texts in prose and poetry, finally to the 18th century, where we have encountered the first novelists in English who wrote in England and who wrote in a variety of themes and styles and influenced later writers as well. Thank you.